Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. There is a specific kind of love that a daughter carries for her mother. Not the uncomplicated reverence of childhood, but the kind that deepens over time, that becomes a conscious, chosen thing, a relationship shaped by understanding and gratitude, and the slow recognition of how much one person has given. Kiani De Jesus was 11 years old in the spring of 2014, old enough to feel the full weight of that love, young enough to still believe that the world would protect those who deserve protecting. She would spend the next decade learning, in the most painful way imaginable, that it did not, and then spend another year proving that she would protect her mother herself, even after the moment for protection had long passed. Emilia Arabelli Ignacio was 28 years old in the spring of 2014, a young woman living in Greenbelt, Maryland, a city just outside Washington, D.C., that sits at the crossroads of American ambition, close enough to the capital to feel its energy, large enough in its own right to have its own neighborhoods, its own rhythms, its own communities of people building quiet lives just below the radar of national attention. Emilia was one of those people, and her life, seen from the outside, was a portrait of someone reaching steadily upward. She was a mother first. She had 2 children, Kiani, her 11-year-old daughter, bright and perceptive in the way of children who are closely watched over by a devoted parent, and Joel, her baby son, barely a year old, at the stage of life where the whole world is still new. Emilia worked hard. She cared for her children with the kind of focused, purposeful love that leaves its marks on everything a person does. And she was, in the spring of 2014, just weeks away from one of the most significant achievements of her life. She was preparing to graduate from the University of Maryland with a degree in legal studies. She had chosen that field deliberately. Emilia had grown up understanding the ways in which immigrant communities like her own, communities of people working hard and keeping their heads down and asking for nothing more than the chance to build a decent life, could be left vulnerable by a legal system that was difficult to navigate without resources, without connections, without someone who understood the language of both cultures. She wanted to be that person. She wanted to become a lawyer and offer legal help to the immigrant community, to be the bridge that so many people desperately needed and so rarely found. She had made a plan. She was days away from the beginning of that plan. The man who would take all of it away from her was named Juan Miguel Roman Balderas. He was 34 years old, and he had a history with Emilia that was like so many such histories, composed of chapters that meant different things depending on how you read them. He was the father of her 1-year-old son Joel, which meant that no matter what had happened between them, their lives were bound together by the irreversible fact of parenthood. At some point before April 2014, Emilia and Juan had broken up. At some point before April 2014, they had gotten back together, or attempted to. Their relationship, by the time of the final events, was one of those complicated, unresolved entanglements that can be pulled in either direction by any given conversation, any given evening, any given moment of hope or despair. The family later said that one had never seemed violent around them. He had not, as far as they could observe, shown the warning signs that people are taught to look for: raised voices, controlling behavior, explosive anger in public. Whatever was happening between Juan and Emilia was happening in the private geography of their relationship, in the space between the two of them where no one else could see. What the family knew was that Juan was around, that he was Emilia's recently reconciled boyfriend, that he had a child with her, and that on the evening of April 22nd, 2014, Emilia left the house for what she believed would be a dinner date with him. Her daughter Keaney not known that dinner, the last meal Amelia ever ate, as something that one had manipulated her into. He had reached out, made his case for reconciliation, made an evening sound like an opportunity. Amelia, who was caring for an infant, who was days from graduation, who had every reason to be cautiously optimistic about the life she was building, had said yes. She loved her son's father in the complicated way people love someone when a child binds them, when history binds them, when the hope of repair is stronger than the fear of being wrong. She got dressed. She went to dinner. She never came home. By Tuesday morning, April 22nd, her family had noticed she was gone. Her sister Elizabeth said that Amelia had been due for work early that morning and had not shown up. Cryptic text messages began arriving on family members' phones, messages appearing to come from Juan, messages that were strange enough in their tone and content to make the family deeply uneasy. Something in the language of those texts, some quality that the family could not quite articulate but could viscerally feel, told them that Amelia might be in danger. They tried to reach Juan. His phone went unanswered. The search was carried to the police. Amelia was reported missing. Greenbelt City Police began looking, and what they found, after a week that her family spent in the suspended agony of not knowing, was devastating. On April 25, 2014, a car was discovered parked along Frankfurt Drive in Greenbelt, on a street just near the family's own home. Inside that car was Amelia Ignacio. She had been stabbed multiple times. She was dead. According to investigators, she had been there for several days. Her body left inside her own vehicle, on a street where her children and her family moved through their daily lives, close enough that the proximity itself was an act of cruelty. The murder weapon, a folding pocket knife, was found inside the car. By the time the police arrived with their crime scene tape, and their questions, and their somber, careful process of documenting what had been done to Amelia, the man they immediately wanted to speak with had already disappeared. Juan Miguel Roman Balderas was gone. Police issued arrest warrants for murder and announced that they believed him to be driving a red 2005 Jeep Cherokee with Maryland plates. Within days, investigators formed the conclusion that would define the next decade of the case. Roman had fled the country. He was believed to have crossed into Mexico. The warrant sat open. The case, in the language of law enforcement, remained active. But in the lived experience of Amelia's family, in the grinding, shapeless days of waiting that followed, it had the texture of something that was slowly settling into silence. The police were looking. There were communications through official channels, requests made through the proper international legal frameworks. But the man who had stabbed Amelia and left her in her own car on the street where their son would grow up without his mother was gone. And gone can mean many different things depending on how determined you are and how well hidden someone chooses to be. Keaney De Jesus grew up. She grew up carrying the thing that happened to her mother the way some children carry a heavy book. Always with them, always present, always determining the angle at which they moved through the world. She was 11 when Amelia died, and by the time she was in her late teens and early 20s, she had developed the specific, focused quality of someone who has decided that grief is not something you simply endure, but something you can, if you refuse to accept its passive weight, convert into action. She began researching. She posted old family photographs on social media. Photos of Amelia laughing. Photos of one that investigators had obtained in the early days of the case. Images that would mean nothing to most people, but might mean everything to someone who had crossed paths with him in the years since he disappeared. She reached out to accounts on social media that were dedicated to cold cases and missing persons, pages where communities of people shared information, where strangers volunteered their attention and their networks in service of the unresolved. One of these accounts shared Amelia's story. It reached people who had no connection to Maryland, who had never heard of Greenbelt, who didn't know what a bright, determined young woman who wanted to be a lawyer for her community looked like, but who, once they saw her face, kept it somewhere in their memory. The world is both enormous and surprisingly small. People move across borders and change their names and begin again in new cities, new countries, new lives. But they cannot always change their faces. They cannot always avoid the person at the market, the neighbor on the street, the woman at a social gathering who looks at them and thinks, "I know this person from somewhere." In December 2023, 9.5 years after Amelia was killed, Kiani De Jesus received a message that changed everything. A woman in Mexico, in the state of Veracruz, reached out with information that was both simple and staggering. She knew Juan Miguel Roman Balderas. She knew him not by that name, but by the name he had been using in Mexico, Pablo. He had built a life there, a new family, a new identity constructed from the assumption that no one would cross the ocean of a decade to find him. The woman in Veracruz called the Mexican authorities. Juan Miguel Roman Balderas was arrested. For Kiani, who had been posting and searching and hoping for years, the news arrived with the particular, unsteady quality of something you have wanted for so long that you are not quite sure how to hold it when it arrives. She was 21 years old. Her mother had been dead since she was 11. She had grown up, gone to school, navigated the world, built an identity, all while carrying the open question of whether the man who killed Amelia would ever face what he had done. Now he was in a jail cell in Veracruz. What followed was the legal machinery of extradition, a process that is neither swift nor simple, governed by treaties and documentation and the deliberate, unhurried pace of international law. There were concerns in those early months that corruption within local Mexican authorities might interfere with the process, that Roman might find a way to slip free again before the full weight of the American legal system could reach him. Kiani and her family watched and waited and pushed through the proper channels, the way they had been pushing for 10 years. In May 2025, Juan Miguel Roman Balderas was extradited to the United States and brought to Maryland to face the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Amelia Arabelli Ignacio. He was held without bail. A trial was scheduled. In February 2026, in a courtroom in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, Juan Miguel Roman Balderas pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He showed no emotion. He offered no statement. He sat in the courtroom with the flat, composed expression of a man who had calculated, once more, what response was most advantageous and had chosen silence. Before the sentencing, Kiani De Jesus stood and delivered her victim impact statement. She spoke about her mother, about who Amelia had been, about what Amelia had wanted to become, about the life that had been cut short on a spring evening in 2014 when Amelia went to dinner and never came home. She spoke about what it was like to grow up without her mother, to navigate childhood and adolescence and young adulthood without the woman who had been raising her, to carry the question of justice alongside every ordinary milestone and every quiet moment of daily life. She spoke about her brother Joel, who was 1 year old when Amelia died, and who has grown up knowing his mother only from photographs and the accounts of those who loved her. She cried. The courtroom was silent in the way that courtrooms become when something true and irreducible is being spoken. Juan Miguel Roman Balderas was sentenced to decades in prison. After the sentencing, Kiani spoke to reporters outside the courthouse, and what she said carried the particular mixture of relief and loss that belongs to the conclusion of a case like this. A conclusion that answers the question of accountability without ever fully answering the deeper question of why. She credited the woman in Veracruz whose recognition of a face had set everything in motion. She credited the community of strangers on social media who had shared her posts and kept Amelia's story alive in the years when official channels had grown quiet. She credited her own refusal to let time do what it so often does to cold cases, which is to make them disappear into the vast, indifferent archive of unsolved things. What happened to Amelia Ignacio was not a mystery in any conventional sense. It was not a puzzle that required a detective's insight or a forensic revelation. It was a domestic violence case, the most common, most preventable, and most invisible category of fatal violence, in which a man killed the woman he claimed to love and then fled the consequences of what he had done. The mystery was never what had happened. The mystery was whether accountability would follow, whether the mechanism of justice would reach across the decade and the border and find him before time turned the case into a permanent silence. The answer ultimately was yes. but only because an 11-year-old girl grew up and refused to accept no. Kiani de Jesus did not have the resources of a government agency. She did not have a badge or a database or an international network of law enforcement contacts. She had photographs of her mother, a phone, a social media account, and the kind of determination that grows in children who watch the adults around them grieve without resolution, who decide, in the private architecture of their own will, that they will be the resolution. Emilia Ignacia was 28 years old. She was weeks away from her college graduation. She was going to become a lawyer, and she was going to use that credential in service of people who needed someone in their corner. People like her, people from communities that the legal system often overlooked, people who had built their lives in the spaces between institutions and needed a guide. She had already given her children everything she had. She had given Kiani the kind of foundation that allowed a girl to grow up, despite unimaginable loss, into a young woman capable of doing what Kiani did. That, in the end, is the double-edged nature of Emilia's legacy. She was taken before she could become the lawyer she was studying to be, but she raised, in the years she had, a daughter who proved that the fierce, focused love of one determined person can reach across an ocean and a decade and find the truth, and make it answer for itself. Joel, who was 1 year old when his father killed his mother and fled, is now 12 years old. He has grown up in the care of a family that has loved him and protected him and navigated the impossible task of helping a child understand what happened to his parents. He has a sister who fought for justice in his mother's name. He has the memory of a woman he never really knew, held alive for him by the people who did. And somewhere in Greenbelt, Maryland, on the street where a car once sat with a terrible secret inside it, life has continued, as it always does, imperfectly and persistently, in the direction of something better. Story 2. The morning of Saturday, the 23rd of September, 2023, arrived gently over the village of Champigny, a quiet hamlet nestled within the commune of Plaine, in the Alsace region of northeastern France. The air that day carried the first real chill of the turning season, and the rolling hills of Barin were flushed with the earliest hints of autumn gold. It was the kind of morning that felt ordinary and unhurried, the kind that lulls a small community into the comfortable rhythm of a weekend. Lena Delsarte, 15 years old, was preparing to leave home. She had her whole Saturday planned out in the way only teenagers do, with the simple, beautiful urgency of youth. She was going to take a train from the nearby station at Saint-Blaise-la-Roche, just 3 kilometers from her doorstep, and travel to the city of Strasbourg, where her boyfriend Tao was waiting for her. She had recently sat her national brevet diploma examinations and was now enrolled in a professional aptitude program in a school near her village, studying to become a personal assistant, a vocation that spoke to her gentle, caring nature. She dressed that morning in a gray dress, a white jacket, and white Converse shoes. Before leaving, she was simply a teenager heading to meet someone she cared about. She stepped out of the door and began to walk. The road from Champigny to the Saint-Blaise-la-Roche Patay train station was one she likely knew well. A few kilometers of quiet rural lane that wound through the soft Alsatian countryside. Tao waited in Strasbourg. Minutes stretched into an hour. When Lena still had not arrived, he called her mother with the question any worried boyfriend would ask. "Have you heard from her? Do you know where she is?" The answer he received sent a cold wave through both of them. Her mother, Fanny Grawl, had not heard from her daughter either. The alarm was raised that same Saturday afternoon. The gendarmerie issued a missing person notice, and an investigation into what they called a disturbing disappearance was formally opened. The authorities noted almost immediately that Lena did not fit the profile of a runaway. There were no family conflicts, no financial distress, nothing that might explain a 15-year-old girl walking away from her own life. And there had been no banking activity on her account after the moment she disappeared. She had simply been walking down a road, and then she was gone. In the days that followed, the search for Lena Delsarte became the consuming reality of an entire region. The gendarmerie deployed dog teams to trace the route she had walked. Helicopters swept low over the fields and forests. Drones crossed back and forth over the Alsatian landscape. 7 divers sounded 2 nearby bodies of water. 80 police officers conducted ground sweeps on Thursday, the 28th of September alone, just 5 days after she had vanished. Despite all of it, not a single trace was found along the route she had walked. No sign of a struggle, no discarded belongings, no indication of an accident. Whatever had happened to Lina Dels Arte had happened quickly and invisibly, as if the road itself had swallowed her. Her mother and father, Olivier Dels Arte and Fanny Grahl, who had separated years earlier, were now united in the most agonizing kind of vigil, the wait for news about their only daughter. Fanny, in particular, became a quiet, grieving figure in the public eye, navigating her family's nightmare while the investigation inched forward with no clear answers. As weeks turned to months, investigators worked methodically. They collected thousands of reports from the public. They conducted hundreds of interviews. They analyzed hundreds of vehicles that might have passed through the area on that Saturday morning. Lina's boyfriend Tao was naturally questioned as a matter of procedure. His phone was examined, particularly to review the last video message Lina had reportedly sent him before her disappearance. He was cleared of any involvement, though he later spoke publicly about having received threats and accusations in the toxic atmosphere that sometimes surrounds missing person cases in France. The investigation took a strange and tragic detour in early October 2023, just 8 days after Lina's disappearance. Benjamin Holtzman, a 22-year-old young man who had been Lina's first serious boyfriend the previous year, a relationship that had apparently ended on friendly terms, died in a car accident near Aubernay. He had been clocked driving at 185 kilometers per hour on the D500 road, and when police attempted to stop him, he accelerated and failed to navigate a bend in the road. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The National Gendarmerie investigated and concluded it was an accident, with no connection whatsoever to Lina's disappearance. Yet the coincidence, a 15-year-old girl missing, and then the sudden death of someone close to her, within the same terrible week, cast an additional shadow of grief over everyone who knew her. As the investigation pressed forward in 2024, a deeply troubling piece of Lina's past resurfaced. In June 2022, when Lina was just 13 years old, she had filed a formal complaint of gang rape. The case had been dismissed at the time, classified as an insufficiently characterized offense. More than a year after her disappearance, in January 2024, the Saverne Public Prosecutor's Office announced it was conducting a fresh legal review of that earlier complaint and passed it to the Strasbourg Public Prosecutor's Office, which opened a new judicial investigation for rape committed on a minor under 15 by an adult with an age difference of at least 5 years. The investigators were careful to clarify that this earlier case was formally separate from the kidnapping investigation. Yet the revelation forced France to confront an uncomfortable truth. Lina Dels Arte had been failed before she ever walked down that road in September 2023. A frightened 13-year-old had come forward and had not been heard. Meanwhile, by March 2024, 6 months into the disappearance, investigators brought in 3 individuals for questioning, a man and a couple whose timelines and statements showed inconsistencies. They were taken into custody by the Strasbourg Research Section, held for questioning, and released. Nothing incriminating was found. Another promising lead had dissolved. Then, on the 26th of July, 2024, 10 months after Lina vanished, the investigation turned sharply. The Strasbourg public prosecutor made a stunning announcement. The genetic fingerprint of Lina Dels Arte had been found inside a car. Not just anywhere in the car, but on the seatbelt in the right rear seat. And tucked inside the glove compartment of the same vehicle was Lina's missing handbag. The car was a Ford Puma, registered in Germany. It had been stolen, and in January 2024 it had been involved in an incident in the Aude department in southern France when the driver, a man attempting to flee a customs checkpoint, crashed the vehicle. The car was impounded, but when investigators traced back its GPS movements, they discovered something that made everything click into terrible focus. The Ford Puma had been geolocated near Saint-Blaise-la-Roche on the 23rd of September, 2023, the exact day of Lena's disappearance. The driver of that car had been identified at the time of the January 2024 crash, and had even been sentenced to 15 months in prison, suspended. But at that point, no connection had yet been drawn between him and the missing teenager. His name was Samuel Ganin, 43 years old, a former carpentry teacher at St. Joseph Vocational High School in Besançon, a man with a history that investigators would come to know all too well. Records showed that Ganin had been seen at a petrol station in the Doubs region 2 days before Lena's disappearance, behind the wheel of the same Ford Puma. He had a prior history of violence against women. He had previously attacked 2 women, and he was due to appear in court in July 2024 to face new charges related to violent armed robberies. But Samuel Ganin would never appear in that courtroom. On the 10th of July 2024, he was found dead in Besançon. He had taken his own life by hanging. This happened before investigators had even connected his car to Lena's disappearance. The man who might have answered every question, who might have led the search teams directly to her, was gone. In the weeks that followed his death, a farewell letter he had left behind was reported by the French radio network RTL. The words written in it were chilling in their ambiguity. "I have lost my honor, my dignity, my humanity. I must leave. I do not know how to control myself. It is going too fast." Whether these words referred to his crimes against Lena, to his other charges, or to something else entirely, no one could say with certainty. He had taken his secrets with him. With Ganin dead, the investigation could not be closed. France would not simply let a murdered girl's case end with a suicide. Investigators turned to the evidence with renewed intensity, determined to reconstruct what had happened even without a confession, even without a living suspect. In September 2024, a devastating detail emerged. Lena's DNA and Samuel Ganin's DNA had both been found on ropes recovered from the boot of the Ford Puma. The Strasbourg prosecutor confirmed what this meant in plain, shattering language. Lena had been tied up. A 15-year-old girl walking down a country road on a Saturday morning had been grabbed, bound, and placed in the boot of a car by this man. The GPS trail of the Ford Puma became the most important map investigators had ever followed. Every stop the car had made in the hours and days after the 23rd of September, 2023 was analyzed, cross-referenced, mapped. Search teams were dispatched across France, to the valley of Bruche, to the Vosges, to a forest near Anude, to the Saulx woods near Vesoul. In the Saulx forest alone, 90 gendarmes combed every meter of ground for 3 days, using ground-penetrating radar, the kind of technology more commonly used in archaeological digs, capable of detecting anomalies buried deep below the Earth's surface. They found nothing. The searches continued to creep southward, deeper into central France, following the car's digital footprints across hundreds of kilometers. The GPS data showed that the Ford Puma had made a specific stop on the 24th of September, 2023, the day after Lena disappeared, in an isolated, wooded area in the Nièvre department, near the commune of Sermoise-sur-Loire, some 500 kilometers from where Lena had last been seen. On the 16th of October, 2024, more than 13 months after Lena Delsarte had stepped out of her home in Champigny in a gray dress and white Converse shoes, searchers came to the wooded slopes above Sermoise-sur-Loire. They followed the GPS coordinates that had been mapped from the suspect's car. They moved through the trees and down toward the water. They found her there, fully submerged in a body of water below an embankment, in a remote and secluded area that most of France had never heard of, in a region far removed from the peaceful Alsatian countryside where her story had begun. DNA testing confirmed what searchers feared. The remains were those of Lena Delsarte. The acting chief prosecutor of Strasbourg, Alexander Chevrier, made the announcement to the waiting press. The words fell on a country that had been hoping, against all logic, for a different outcome. France had not forgotten Lena. In the 13 months since her disappearance, her name had circulated on news broadcasts, in forums, in conversations at kitchen tables across the country. and now France mourned her properly, in full knowledge of what had happened. Her funeral was held on Friday, the 25th of October, 2024, at the St. Arnold Church in Plain, the commune where she had grown up, not far from the road she had walked on the last morning of her life. The autumn trees of Alsace would have stood quiet and golden around the church walls. Her family, having endured more than a year of not knowing, now faced the final and irreversible truth. In December 2024, the Strasbourg public prosecutor released the conclusions of the forensic investigation, carefully worded but clear in their direction. The cause of death could not be formally established. The body had been submerged in water for over a year, and the state of degradation was significant. Forensic pathologists were appropriately cautious, but several marks found between the base of the skull and the top of the neck, alongside the presence of a piece of fabric in the same area, led investigators to favor a specific conclusion: death by mechanical strangulation, using the handles of a bag. Analysis of the fabric identified it as part of a tote bag. Gynecological examinations could not be performed, leaving some questions permanently unanswered. But prosecutors stated clearly that all available evidence pointed in one direction: the actions of Samuel Gonin, acting alone. His DNA on the ropes that had bound her. His car parked near where she disappeared. His GPS trail leading, step by step, to the place her body was found. His own farewell letter, with its haunting admission of having lost his humanity. It was a conclusion built from science and GPS coordinates and fragments of fabric found in a submerged stream, because no living perpetrator remained to face justice. And yet it was a conclusion nonetheless, as complete as the investigation could make it in the absence of the one man who held all the answers. In the aftermath of the discovery, France did not simply move on. The country grappled with difficult questions about the earlier rape complaint Lena had filed at 13. The complaint that had been dismissed as insufficiently characterized. A fresh investigation had been opened into that matter in 2024, and the broader question of how France protects its most vulnerable children hung heavily in public discourse. The family of Lena Delzarte continued to live with losses that stacked upon one another. Samuel Gonin, the former carpentry teacher from Besançon, the man with prior convictions for violence against women, the man whose GPS trail led across half of France to where a child's body lay in the water. He was never questioned. He was never tried. He was never made to stand in a courtroom and face the parents of Lena Delzarte. He deprived them of that, along with everything else he had taken. Lena Delzarte was born on the 10th of August, 2008. She had light green eyes and blonde hair, and stood 1.60 meters tall. She had just passed her national brevet diploma, and was beginning a vocational program to become a personal assistant, someone who would help and care for others. She had a boyfriend named Tao who waited for her in Strasbourg on a Saturday morning that she never reached. She had parents who loved her and a community that searched for her across 13 months of anguish and hope. She was only 15 years old. The case of Lena Delzarte is, in many respects, a story of what could not be recovered. Not just a young girl taken from a country road in autumn, but the full truth of what happened to her, the justice her family deserved, and the years of a life that was never allowed to unfold. What remains is what the evidence preserved: a GPS trail, a pair of ropes, a fragment of fabric, and the name of a 15-year-old girl from Alsace who was on her way to meet someone she cared about, on an ordinary Saturday, in the quiet hills of northeastern France, and who never arrived. Story 3. There is a silence that settles over a house on a summer morning, slow, warm, deceptively peaceful. On the 10th of August, 2023, a police constable approached a terraced house on Hammond Road, in the quiet residential area of Horsell in Woking, Surrey, England. He had been sent there in response to a phone call made hours earlier from thousands of miles away. He knocked. He entered, and in a bunk bed upstairs, he found the body of a 10-year-old girl. Her name was Sarah Sharif. Sarah Sharif came into this world on the 11th of January, 2013, in Slough, Berkshire, And even before she had taken her first breath outside the warmth of the womb, the adults who were supposed to protect her had already been flagged as a danger to her. Authorities placed her under a child protection plan from the moment of her birth. The concerns surrounding her parents were not abstract or speculative. They were documented, reported, and real. Her father, Irfan Sharif, was a Pakistani-born taxi driver who had moved to the United Kingdom in 2001 from Jhelum, a city in Pakistan's Punjab province. Those who had known him described a man of difficult, unpredictable temperament. Former partners had reported harrowing experiences. One woman, Angelica, said that he had threatened her with a knife, attempted to brand her with his initials, and held her captive in his flat before she escaped and returned to Poland. Another former partner, Anna, similarly accused him of imprisoning her for 5 days. The pattern was not hidden. It was recorded, and yet Irfan Sharif was never convicted of these offenses. Sarah's mother, Olga Daman, a Polish woman whom Irfan had met and married in 2009, was described by social services as vulnerable, a woman with learning difficulties who had become trapped in an abusive relationship that mirrored the ones Irfan had conducted before. Olga's own family back in Poland had initially been charmed by Irfan. Her father described him as a great manipulator. Her stepmother compared him to a Polish serial fraudster, known for deceiving and exploiting women. Within a year of their marriage, Irfan had been arrested for assaulting Olga. Olga would later tell social workers that he had tightened a belt around her neck, locked her in rooms, taken her phone away, and once tried to set her on fire, stopped only by the arrival of a cousin. Sarah, born into this household of documented violence, was placed into foster care as a newborn. After a period of supervised visitation, she was returned to her parents under monitoring in September 2013. In 2015, the couple separated. Sarah and her brother went to live with their mother, Olga. For a brief period, the girl who had been born under a cloud of risk seemed to have landed somewhere safer. That safety would not last. By 2019, through a series of family court hearings, custody of Sarah and her siblings shifted to Irfan. The precise path of that decision, how it was reached, which judges signed off on it, which professionals recommended it, became one of the most scrutinized questions in Britain in the years that followed Sarah's death. What is known as this: Sarah, at one point during court proceedings, told a social worker that her mother hit her, and said of her father and stepmother, "They don't hit me." She was 6 years old, a child, trying to navigate the treacherous terrain of adult conflict, not knowing that the people she had just defended would become the architects of her suffering. By this time, Irfan had entered a new relationship with a woman named Baynash Batul, 12 years his junior. Baynash had herself come from a difficult background. She had experienced so-called honor-based abuse as a teenager and had once lived in a shelter. She had met Irfan under circumstances that remained disputed. Irfan claimed he had met her in his taxi. Others said he had obtained her phone number from a shopkeeper near Woking railway station. Her family had cut off contact with her after the relationship began. Her father disowned her. She became entirely dependent on Irfan's world. Sarah now lived in a house in Horsell, Woking, a property that had been home to Irfan, Baynash, their own children together, Irfan's brother Faisal Malik, and Sarah. It was a full, crowded, noisy household. What happened inside its walls was not invisible. Neighbors heard it. Teachers saw the signs of it. But they were not stopped. The abuse that Sarah endured in that house was described as a campaign of torture. It did not erupt overnight. It built gradually and systematically over more than 2 years, a slow, escalating cruelty that tested and then exhausted the limits of what a child's body could endure. Sarah was beaten regularly. Irfan struck her with a cricket bat, with a metal pole, and with a mobile phone. She was restrained with tape, her head covered with a makeshift hood, so that she could not see what was coming. She was bitten, not once but repeatedly, the human bite marks found on her body during the post-mortem examination, serving as silent witnesses to the intimacy of the cruelty inflicted upon her. She was scalded with boiling water, her feet bearing the marks of it. She was burned on her bottom with a clothes iron, Irfan forced Sarah to perform sit-ups through the entire night, a form of punishment so petty in its origin, so devastating in its effect on an already injured child, because she had hidden his keys. Neighbors would later tell investigators and reporters that they had heard things that should have driven someone to act. One neighbor described hearing constant crying and screaming that had been escalating for months, reaching what she called a fever pitch in the final weeks of Sarah's life. Another neighbor reported hearing a young girl scream in pain just 2 days before Sarah died. This same neighbor had knocked on the door out of concern for the family's welfare. Bainash had simply turned her away. Sarah wore a hijab to school from January 2023 onwards. Teachers noticed nothing unusual at first. The hijab was not uncommon. But in March 2023, a teacher saw something. The fabric had shifted, and bruising was visible on Sarah's face. The school made a referral to social services. Irfan responded by emailing the school the following month. Sarah would no longer be attending. She was being homeschooled, he said, with immediate effect. The school door, one of the last windows through which the outside world could have glimpsed Sarah's suffering, was quietly and efficiently closed. She was removed from every structure that might have seen her. Between the day of Sarah's birth and the day of her death, authorities were made aware of the risk to her on 15 separate occasions. 15. Surrey police had been involved. Social services had been involved. The family court system had been involved. Schools had been involved. Each of these agencies had pieces of the picture. Irfan's history of violence against women, the bite marks and bruises on Sarah's siblings, the social workers who had noted that Sarah flinched when her father came near her, the fact that she had shouted at him to go away during supervised visits when she was younger. One social worker had written in her notes that she believed Irfan lacked empathy. Another had documented that Sarah was visibly surprised, as if it were unexpected, as if it were foreign, on the rare occasions when her father embraced her rather than punished her. And yet, in 2019, a family court judge handed Sarah to him. The independent safeguarding review published in November 2025, nearly 2 years after Sarah's death, was unsparing in its conclusions. It found that Irfan's history as a serial perpetrator of domestic abuse had been overlooked, not acted on, and underestimated by almost all professionals who came into contact with the family. It concluded that Irfan and Bainash were a lethal combination, and that they should never have been trusted with Sarah's care. The report stated plainly, the system failed to keep her safe. Neighborhood reluctance played its own painful role. Residents who suspected abuse admitted they had been afraid to report it, fearing they would be accused of racism. That fear, however understandable its origins, had real consequences for a child who needed someone to speak for her. On the 8th of August, 2023, Sarah Sharif died. She was 10 years and 6 months old. On that same day, Sarah's older brother sent a text message to a friend. It was a short message. It said that his sister had died. A few hours later, Bainash Batul placed a call to a travel agency and began inquiring about flights to Pakistan. The call ended without tickets being booked. Then later, Irfan contacted an ad hoc travel agent he had known for 11 years, a man named Nadeem Riaz. Irfan said he needed 8 one-way tickets to Islamabad. He told Riaz that his cousin had died. Riaz later said that he had noticed nothing unusual in the conversation. 8 one-way tickets for a family whose daughter had just died. Not a single return journey planned. On the morning of the 9th of August, 2023, Irfan Sharif, Bainash Batul, and Irfan's brother Faisal Malik boarded a flight at an English airport and flew to Islamabad. They left Sarah behind them. The door of the house on Hammond Road was closed. Upstairs, in a bunk bed, lay the body of a child. In the early hours of the 10th of August, 2023, shortly after the plane landed in Pakistan, Irfan Sharif dialed 999, the emergency services line, from Islamabad. The recording of that call would later be heard in a courtroom at the Old Bailey in London. Irfan's voice on the recording said, "I've killed my daughter." He told the dispatcher that it had not been his intention to kill her, that he had beaten her but had not meant to take her life. He said, "I'm a cruel father." When police arrived at the house on Hammond Road hours later, they found Sarah in her bunk bed. Near her body, Irfan had left a handwritten note. It was addressed to Sarah. He apologized for her death. He asked that she be buried in accordance with Islamic funeral traditions. The post-mortem examination conducted on the 15th of August, 2023 revealed the full extent of what Sarah had endured. She had more than 70 recent injuries on her body. These included 11 fractures to her spine, injuries that a pediatric radiologist testified were very rare and comparable to those typically seen in victims of traffic collisions. There were fractures to her ribs, her shoulder blades, her fingers, and her wrists. There was a puncture wound to her head. There was a traumatic brain injury. There were burns from an iron. There were scalding marks on her feet. There were bruises caused by blunt objects. There were human bite marks. The cause of death was formally recorded as complications arising from multiple injuries and neglect. The Chief Constable of Surrey Police, Tim DeMeyer, would later say that Sarah's death was a crime of the most unimaginable and unspeakable evil, and that the case was about as bad as I have ever seen. A detective chief superintendent who had spent 30 years working in policing said that he had never seen such horrific suffering of a young person. Britain watched, in a state of collective grief and quiet fury, as the story unfolded in the days and weeks after Sarah's body was found. The 3 adults who had been with Sarah, her father, her stepmother, and her uncle, had fled to Pakistan. There was no extradition treaty between the United Kingdom and Pakistan. The legal avenues were narrow. The anger was wide. Surrey police issued a public appeal 2 weeks after Sarah's body was discovered, urging anyone with information to come forward. Irfan's father, Mohammed Sharif, spoke to reporters from his home in Jhelum. He confirmed that Irfan had visited him while fleeing. He said that Irfan had told him Sarah's death was accidental. He said that Irfan was hiding because he was afraid, and added, with a kind of exhausted resignation, that Irfan was probably not thinking properly. On the 5th of September, 2023, Irfan and Bainash released a short video, their first public statement since the discovery of Sarah's body. In it, they referred to what had happened to Sarah as an incident. They said they were willing to cooperate with UK authorities. The use of the word incident to describe the death of a 10-year-old child, made public while British investigators were searching for them, created a wave of revulsion across the country. On the 12th of September, Pakistani police raided Mohammed Sharif's house in Jhelum. They found Irfan's 5 living children, who were taken into the custody of the Pakistani government. They were found to be in good condition. The next day, the 13th of September, 2023, Irfan Sharif, Bainash Batul, and Faisal Malik arrived at Gatwick Airport on a flight from Sialkot via Dubai. They had chosen to come back. They were arrested on the tarmac on suspicion of murder. The trial of Irfan Sharif, Bainash Batul, and Faisal Malik began on the 8th of October, 2024, before a jury at the Old Bailey, England's most historic criminal court, the building whose dome had looked down on the trials of the most serious cases in English legal history for centuries. The 3 defendants pleaded not guilty. What unfolded over the course of the trial was a systematic and meticulous reconstruction of Sarah's final months. A timeline built from mobile phone records, car location data, bank card usage, CCTV footage, and the testimony of neighbors, teachers, social workers, and medical experts. The prosecution presented it all with careful precision. Irfan, in the witness box, accepted full responsibility for causing Sarah's death. He called himself the worst parent on the planet. But in the same breath, he attempted to deflect blame onto Bainash, calling her the true villain of the piece. Bainash, for her part, had attempted to justify the abuse as punishment for Sarah's naughty behavior, and had claimed at various points that the behavior was caused by jinn possession, an evil spirit in Islamic theology. The jury considered all of it. On the 11th of December, 2024, the jury delivered its verdicts. Irfan Sharif, guilty of murder. Bainash Batul, guilty of murder. Faisal Malik, guilty of causing or allowing the death of a child. On the 17th of December, 2024, the sentencing judge handed down the decisions. Irfan Sharif was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 40 years before he could be considered for parole. Bainash Batul was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 33 years. Faisal Malik was sentenced to 16 years. The Crown Prosecution Service prosecutor, Libby Clark, spoke outside the court. She described Sarah as a happy, outgoing and lively child described as always laughing. She said that none of us could imagine how appalling and brutal Sarah's treatment had been in the last weeks of her short life. She said, "We have secured justice for Sarah, a bubbly young girl who was killed by the adults who should have protected her." Sarah Sharif was buried in a quiet cemetery in eastern Poland, near the undisclosed village where her mother, Olga, had returned after Sarah's death. She was buried under her mother's surname, Daman. The woman who had loved Sarah but had been unable to protect her from the court's decision to hand her to Irfan had, in the end, given her daughter back the name she deserved. The legal processes continued in the months that followed. In January 2025, the Solicitor General's office asked the Court of Appeal to impose a whole life sentence on Irfan, meaning he would never be released under any circumstances. The appeal was denied. Irfan and Bainash also appealed to have their own sentences reduced. Those appeals were denied too. All three sentences stood. Parliament, moved by the case and by the safeguarding review that had exposed 15 missed opportunities, began the work of reforming the law. The Children's Well-Being in Schools bill included new provisions that would make it illegal for parents to homeschool their children if a child protection investigation was already underway or if the child was under a child protection plan, a direct response to the method by which Irfan had removed Sarah from the only eyes that might have seen her bruises in time. In March 2025, the Member of Parliament for Woking proposed an amendment to the bill named Sarah's Law, designed to facilitate greater communication between social services and schools. In June 2025, the amendment was introduced in the House of Lords. Sarah's name, given to a piece of legislation designed to protect children who might otherwise fall through the same cracks she had fallen through, was perhaps the most fitting memorial the British Parliament could have offered her. A law, born from her suffering, designed to ensure that no child would be silenced the way she had been silenced. Sarah Sharif loved to laugh. That is what the prosecutor said. That is what the people who knew her in her earlier years said. She was described as happy, outgoing, lively, a child who filled rooms with energy and sound and motion. She had been placed under a protection plan before she ever opened her eyes. She had been passed between parents, scrutinized by social workers, entered into the records of courts and police files and school safeguarding registers. She had worn a hijab to hide bruises. She had told a social worker that the people who were hurting her were not hurting her, because she was 6 years old and didn't know yet what truth could cost her. She had endured more than 2 years of escalating cruelty in a house full of adults who all knew what was happening. She had screamed, 2 days before she died, loud enough for a neighbor outside the walls to recognize it as a scream of pain. And then the house fell quiet. The silence on Hammond Road on the morning of the 10th of August, 2023, was not the peace of an ordinary summer morning. It was the silence of a system's failure made absolute. A 10-year-old girl, who had spent her entire short life inside the machinery of child protection, had died inside it, not because the machinery did not exist, but because it had, at every critical moment, failed to move fast enough, firmly enough, or bravely enough on her behalf. Sarah Sharif deserved better. She deserved it from the moment she was born. She deserved it every time a social worker closed a file, every time a school hesitated, every time a neighbor stayed quiet, every time a court weighed the rights of a known abuser against the safety of a child and reached the wrong answer. She deserved better than the note that was left beside her body, written by the hand of the man who had hurt her, asking that she be buried properly, as if propriety were a form of love, as if the rituals of death could undo the violence of life. She was 10 years old. She was described as always laughing. Story 4. The night was ordinary in the way that only the last ordinary nights can be. Somewhere in Louisville, Kentucky, on the 1st of April, 1992, a 19-year-old girl with her whole life stretching out ahead of her came home from a grocery store parking lot, sat down with her mother, and told her something small and strange. A man she had never met had approached her in that lot, stared at her with unsettling intensity, and told her he wanted to marry her. It was the kind of story that gets told over a kitchen table, shrugged off with a laugh, and forgotten by morning. Rhonda Sue Warford laughed it off. Her mother laughed too. They could not have known that those easy, passing words would be among the last Rhonda would ever speak at home, and that the stranger from the parking lot would one day rise like a ghost from the margins of a catastrophically flawed investigation, whispering a truth no one in power had cared to hear. Just past midnight, Rhonda left the house again. Her family assumed she had gone back to the lot, the way she always did, that warm, loose gathering of young people killing time under the glow of streetlights, the way young people do in cities everywhere. They weren't worried. They went to sleep. Rhonda never came home. 3 days later, her body was discovered in a field in Meade County, Kentucky, roughly 50 miles from her Louisville home, in a place she had no obvious reason to be. She had been stabbed many times. Her hands bore defensive wounds, the silent testimony of someone who had fought back, who had not given up without a struggle. The wound that ended her life was at the base of her skull, severing her brain stem. The grief that descended on her family was the kind that reshapes everything, the kind you never fully climb out from under. Her mother, desperate to make sense of what had happened to her daughter, reached into her memory for anything that could explain the inexplicable. She told police that she believed Rhonda and some of her friends had been involved in Satanism. It was an offhand remark born from grief and confusion, the kind of thing a frightened parent grasps at in the dark. But the Louisville police detective who would lead the investigation, a man named Mark Handy, known across the department for his reputation of solving difficult cases, particularly through obtaining confessions, heard that one word, Satanism, and built a cathedral around it. The investigation turned almost immediately toward two young men, Keith Harden, who was 22 years old and had been dating Rhonda for about 5 months, and his friend Jeffrey Clark, who was 21 and had previously socialized with Rhonda's sister. In any murder case, it is natural to begin with those closest to the victim. Harden was Rhonda's boyfriend. Of course detectives would want to speak with him, but what began as a logical starting point quietly, steadily, and fatally became the only point, a tunnel through which investigators refused to look anywhere else. Both men were interviewed separately. Both gave the same account. On the night of April 1st and into the early morning hours of April 2nd, they had been together at Clark's trailer in Louisville, drinking beer and searching for one of Clark's missing pet snakes. It was an unglamorous alibi, the kind that couldn't be proven by a receipt or a security camera, only by the word of two men who had every reason, investigators thought, to lie. Harden said the last time he had seen Rhonda was 3 days before she disappeared, when he had spent the night at her home. Clark said he hadn't seen her since December 1991. When police searched the men's homes, they found items that, to eyes already primed to see a certain kind of story, looked like damning evidence. There were knives. There were objects described as occult-related. In Harden's home, officers found a broken glass chalice and a handkerchief with a bloodstain on it. Harden had a simple explanation. He had dropped the chalice, cut himself on the broken glass while picking up the pieces, and used the handkerchief to wipe the blood. It was the kind of mundane accident that happens in any household. But Detective Handy, through the fog of the satanic theory that now dominated his thinking, had a different interpretation entirely. Handy later reported that Harden had admitted, during questioning, that he had once been involved in Satanism, that he had sacrificed animals, and that he had begun to want to sacrifice a human being. These were extraordinary claims. There was no recording of this supposed admission. There was no witness to it other than Handy himself. But it would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. On May 5, 1992, Just over a month after Rhonda's body was found, Keith Hardin and Jeffrey Clark were arrested and indicted for aggravated murder. The community exhaled. The case was solved. The killers were in custody. Two young men who dabbled in dark rituals had sacrificed a young woman to a demon they worshipped in the shadows. It was a terrifying story, and it was almost entirely fiction. The trial did not begin until February 1995, nearly 3 years after Rhonda's death. In the intervening time, something remarkable had happened that the prosecution chose to ignore. A woman had testified under oath before a Meade County special grand jury that a man named James Whiteley had confessed to her that he had picked up Rhonda Warford from the grocery store parking lot, driven her to Meade County, 50 miles from Louisville, exactly where her body was found, and killed her after they got into an argument. Police did not pursue this lead. The name James Whiteley was quietly set aside. The witness's account, given under oath before a grand jury, was left to gather dust. The trial in Meade County Circuit Court was, by any honest accounting, a theater of suggestion rather than a courtroom of evidence. The prosecution called witness after witness to sketch a portrait of Clark and Hardin as men in league with dark forces. An ex-girlfriend of Clark's named Amy Remsburg, who would later be convicted of abusing her own child, a complaint Clark himself had made before the trial, told the jury that Clark had once told her it would be a challenge to commit a murder and get away with it. She testified that he had explained to her precisely how a person could be killed by a stab wound to the base of the skull. That detail, the base of the skull, was chilling, since it corresponded exactly to the fatal wound Rhonda had suffered. At trial, however, the defense revealed that in a tape-recorded interview conducted shortly after the crime, Remsburg had never once mentioned the brain stem. The detail had apparently materialized in her memory over the years, with helpful encouragement. Remsburg also claimed that Clark was once involved in satanic worship, that he owned an arsenal of knives and guns, and that he had an inverted cross tattooed on his shoulder. Clark responded to this last claim in the most direct way possible. He bared his arms and chest to the jury, revealing no tattoo, no marking, nothing at all. Another witness, Hope Jaggers, who had been Rhonda's friend, testified that she once heard Hardin threaten Rhonda, that if she was pregnant, he would kill her and the baby. It was powerful, emotionally loaded testimony. But during cross-examination, something slipped through. Jaggers admitted that she and Rhonda had, at the grocery store parking lot, met a man named James. They had partied with him. A man named James at the grocery store parking lot, in the same place where Rhonda had been approached by the strange man who said he wanted to marry her. In the same place where the witness before the grand jury had said a man named James Whiteley picked Rhonda up and drove her to her death. The defense noted the connection. The prosecution moved on. The physical evidence, when examined with any rigor, was almost nothing. Rhonda's fingerprint had been found inside Clark's car, but there was no dispute that she had been in his car before, and the prosecution's own forensic expert admitted there was no way to determine how old a fingerprint was. There was no way to prove the print had been left on the night she disappeared rather than weeks earlier. The hair was different. The hair felt more concrete. A forensic analyst from the Kentucky State Police Crime Laboratory named Robert Thurman had examined hairs recovered from Rhonda's body, from her hands and from her red sweatpants. He testified that a hair found on the sweatpants was similar in color and microscopic characteristics to Hardin's hair. In the courtroom, the prosecution pressed him further, again and again, until he used the word that no competent hair analyst should ever use, match. He told the jury that for analysts to call a match, two hairs must match in characteristics. He compared them side by side and said they matched. The prosecution, in its closing argument, thundered that the hair on the sweatpants that had apparently just been laundered, was just like Hardin's hair, proof that he had been with Rhonda after the date he claimed. There was also the jailhouse informant. A man named Clifford Capps, who had been held in the Meade County Jail while Hardin and Clark awaited trial, testified that Clark had confessed the murder to him, not once, but twice. Jailhouse informants are among the most unreliable figures in the criminal justice system, individuals who have everything to gain from telling prosecutors what they want to hear. Capps was no exception. Before the trial even concluded, a letter came to light that he had written to another incarcerated person, urging that person to similarly claim that Hardin had confessed. It was a blueprint for coordinated false testimony, written in Capps's own hand. The defense tried to use it. The court denied a new trial. On March 7, 1995, the jury convicted both Gar Keith Hardin and Jeffrey Clark of murder. They were sentenced to life in prison. The family of Rhonda Warford believed justice had been done. The state of Kentucky believed justice had been done. Two men were led away in chains for a satanic ritual killing that had never actually happened, convicted on fabricated confessions, misrepresented forensic evidence, and a theory of murder so lurid and unfounded that it required its architects to simply choose not to look at any evidence that contradicted it. For over a decade, Clark and Hardin sat in prison. They maintained their innocence. No one in authority listened. The appeals courts reviewed the case and affirmed the convictions. The legal system, having processed them once, had no great appetite for processing them again. What changed everything was science, specifically the science of DNA. In 2009, the Innocence Project and the Kentucky Innocence Project began seeking DNA testing of the physical evidence in the case. The request was denied by the circuit court. For years, the two organizations fought simply to get the evidence tested. Finally, in 2013, the Kentucky Supreme Court reversed the lower court's decision and ordered that the physical evidence be submitted for DNA analysis. It was a turning point, small, bureaucratic, and momentous. The results came in 2014. Mitotyping Technologies in Pennsylvania, a laboratory specializing in mitochondrial DNA analysis, examined the hair that had been presented at trial as a match to Hardin's hair. The hair on the freshly laundered red sweatpants that the prosecution had argued proved Hardin was a liar. The results were unambiguous. The hair did not belong to Hardin. It did not belong to Clark. It did not belong to Rhonda Warford. It belonged to an unknown person who had never been identified, never been investigated, and never been pursued. Testing on the blood-stained handkerchief was equally definitive. The blood was not animal blood. It was human blood. It was Hardin's blood, exactly as he had testified at trial, when he said he had cut himself picking up broken glass. The prosecution had told the jury this was sacrificial animal blood used in a satanic ritual. The laboratory said it was the blood of a man who had cleaned up broken glass in his own home. In February 2015, lawyers filed a motion for a new trial. What followed was not swift or clean. The prosecution appealed. A new grand jury was convened in September 2016, and indictments were issued, not for the original murder, but for perjury and kidnapping. The perjury charge against Clark stemmed from statements he had made to a parole board years earlier, in which, by his own account, he had said what he needed to say to have any hope of release. The Kentucky Supreme Court later described these statements with quiet devastation as insincere and contrived admissions, induced solely by the yearning to be free. On July 14, 2016, Meade County Circuit Court Judge Bruce Butler entered a 25-page order vacating both convictions. He found that the two men had been excluded by the DNA evidence, that no credible evidence had been presented supporting the theory of Satanism, and that the convictions had been built on what he called suppositions that we now know to be fundamentally false. He found that this false evidence casts a long shadow on the entire trial. Judge Butler also noted that Detective Mark Handy, the man who had built this case, who had reportedly extracted Hardin's admission about wanting to sacrifice humans, who had been the central figure of the investigation, had been criminally investigated for giving false testimony in other cases. In August 2016, after more than 2 decades behind bars, Hardin and Clark were released on bond. In January 2018, Judge Butler dismissed the new kidnapping and perjury charges, calling them a vindictive prosecution. On February 26, 2018, the charges were formally dismissed. In 2021, Detective Mark Handy pleaded guilty to perjury and evidence tampering. He admitted that he had recorded over a witness statement in another case and committed perjury at another man's trial. He received a 1-year sentence for crimes that had contributed to sending innocent men to prison for decades. The civil reckoning came in waves. In 2023, Louisville Metro government agreed to pay $20.5 million to Clark and Hardin in their wrongful conviction lawsuits. Then, in April 2026, a federal jury awarded Jeffrey Clark an additional $24.35 million in compensatory damages and $75,000 in punitive damages from Meade County, its former sheriff, a deputy, and the former coroner. Officials the jury found had conspired to wrongfully imprison him. In total, the financial acknowledgement of what had been done to these two men reached $44 million. It was called one of the largest civil rights verdicts in the history of Kentucky. No amount of money, of course, can give back 22 years. It cannot give back the ordinary life Clark might have built at 21. The relationships, the mornings, the quiet accumulation of days that constitute a human existence. It cannot give Hardin back the years he spent separated from the world while the real killer of his girlfriend walked free. And it cannot give Rhonda Sue Warford anything at all. She was 19 years old. She had been harassed by a stranger in a parking lot and told her mother about it with a laugh. She had gone out past midnight into a spring night in Louisville, Kentucky, and she had never come home. Her murder remains unsolved. The stranger from the parking lot, the man who said he wanted to marry her, if he was James Whiteley, the man named in sworn testimony before a grand jury, the man whose name a witness gave investigators more than 30 years ago, has never been charged. The unknown person whose hair was found on Rhonda's sweatpants, the hair that was not Hardin's, not Clark's, not anyone investigators ever identified, that person has never been found. The field in Meade County where Rhonda was discovered, 50 miles from the grocery store lot where her young life intersected with something terrible, holds a silence that the justice system has never managed to break. The case of Rhonda Sue Warford is, at its core, two stories braided together, each one a tragedy in its own right. The first is the story of a young woman who was murdered and whose killer was never found, whose family was given the false comfort of a conviction, and then had even that taken away. The second is the story of what happens when investigators fixate on a theory before the evidence is gathered, when a word like Satanism functions as a kind of gravity that pulls everything toward it regardless of where the facts actually lead, when a detective's reputation for getting confessions becomes more important than whether those confessions are true. Both stories have the same ending, a question that remains unanswered, a name on a headstone, and a field in Kentucky where justice has never arrived. Whoever killed Rhonda Warford is still out there, somewhere, in the long silence of an unsolved case. While two men who lost more than 2 decades of their lives in prison for a crime they did not commit have walked back into a world that moved on without them, carrying wounds that $44 million can acknowledge but never fully heal. Rhonda deserved better. So did the truth. Story 5. The night had the kind of warm, easy softness that Louisiana spring evenings carry like a gift. The air thick with the scent of blossoming trees, the streets of Lafayette quiet and draped in amber light. It was the early hours of May 19th, 2012, and 21-year-old Michaela Shunick, known to everyone who loved her simply as Mickey, was pedaling her bicycle home through familiar streets, the kind of streets you navigate on instinct, the way you navigate rooms in your own house in the dark. She had just spent the evening at the home of her friend Bretley Wilson, doing what young people do in the small, unhurried hours between midnight and dawn, talking, laughing, letting the hours slide by without watching them. Mickey was that kind of person, easy to be around, effortlessly warm, the sort of girl who filled a room with energy not by demanding attention, but simply by being genuinely, unguardedly herself. She was a senior at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, days away from turning 22. A young woman on the edge of everything her life would become. Just before 2 in the morning, she said her goodbyes, climbed onto her black and gold Schwinn bicycle, and rolled out into the night. The ride home was short. The streets were familiar. There was nothing, in any ordinary version of that evening, that should have gone wrong. But on St. Landry Street, something terrible was already moving toward her. A white Chevrolet Z71 pickup truck, cruising slowly behind a girl on a bicycle. The truck changed lanes when she changed lanes. It turned corners when she turned corners. It was not a coincidence. The man behind the wheel, 33-year-old Brandon Scott Laverne, had been driving around Lafayette that night, drinking whiskey, telling himself in the vague, purposeless way of predators that he was simply hungry, perhaps heading for a Whataburger restaurant a few miles away. But predators rarely tell themselves the truth about what they are doing, and what Laverne was doing, in those slow, hunting miles through the sleeping city, was looking for someone to victimize. He found Mickey Shunick. He hit the rear wheel of Mickey's bicycle with the front of his truck. The impact threw her to the ground. Then he jumped out of the vehicle, apologizing. Mickey was shaken and angry, as anyone would be. Her bicycle was damaged. Laverne offered her money for the repairs. He offered to drive her home. What happened next would become one of the most anguished questions in the minds of everyone who loved Mickey. Did she choose to get in, or was she forced? She was hesitant. Of course she was hesitant. Her instincts, the quiet warning system that exists in all of us, would have whispered that something was wrong. But she was a young woman alone on an empty street at 2 a.m, her bicycle damaged, faced with a man who was calm and apologetic and offering a ride home. The calculus of that moment, the impossible arithmetic of trust and fear and social pressure, led her to step into his truck. Laverne loaded her bicycle into the truck's bed, and they drove away into the dark. Inside the cab of the truck, Mickey quickly understood what she had walked into. She reached for her phone to call for help. Laverne, who had both a knife and a semi-automatic handgun on him, threatened to stab her if she did not put the phone down. And this is where the story of Mickey Shunick becomes something more than a story of victimhood. Because Mickey Shunick, in the most terrifying moments of her life, did not surrender. She reached into her bag and pulled out a can of mace. She sprayed it directly into Laverne's face. In the chaos that followed, the burning, the swerving, the struggle in the cab of a moving vehicle, she somehow managed to get hold of his knife. She turned it on him, stabbing him repeatedly. The court documents described these wounds as life-threatening. A young woman with no training and every reason to freeze instead fought back with a ferocity that would leave lasting marks on the man who had taken her. She gave him injuries severe enough to kill him if left untreated. But Laverne was larger and stronger, and eventually he took the knife back. He stabbed Mickey at least 4 times. She fell. He thought she was dead. He drove for 30 to 40 minutes through the dark Louisiana countryside, heading toward an isolated sugar cane field in North Acadia Parish. A place of total silence, total remoteness. A place where the only thing a person can hear is the wind moving through tall grass. He carried Mickey into that field. She was not dead. When Laverne returned to his truck, Mickey Shunick, stabbed 4 times, mace in the air around her, alone in a field in the middle of the night, gathered the last of everything she had. She got up. She found his knife. And for the second time that night, she fought back. She lunged at Laverne and stabbed him in the chest. He pulled out his semi-automatic handgun. He shot her in the head. She died instantly, in a sugar cane field in Acadia Parish, miles from the streets she had grown up navigating on her bicycle, days before her 22nd birthday. Back in Lafayette, when the morning came and Mickey had not come home, her family made the calls you make when you first believe, still desperately, that everything might be fine. Maybe she had stayed at a friend's. Maybe the phone was dead. But by the time those possibilities had been exhausted, the Shunick family knew something was catastrophically wrong, and the search for Mickey Shunick began. Her sister Charlie became the center of it. Charlie Shunick was everything a family anchor becomes in a crisis: relentless, organized, public, fearless in her grief. She took to social media, she organized volunteers, she spoke to cameras with eyes full of tears that she refused to let stop her from speaking clearly. "She's my mini-me," Charlie told reporters in those early days, her voice breaking in the way a voice breaks, when it is carrying more weight than voices are built to carry. She's one of my best friends, and I just miss her, and I want to know what's going on. The community of Lafayette responded to her call. Nearly 1,000 volunteers joined the search, walking the routes Mickey might have taken, checking fields and waterways, putting up flyers. The FBI, Louisiana State Police, and local officers worked alongside neighbors, church groups, strangers who had simply heard the story on the news and could not stay home. The family announced a reward of $25,000 for any information. 8 days after Mickey disappeared, searchers found her bicycle. It was in Whiskey Bay, an area straddling Iberville and Assumption parishes, roughly 25 miles from where she had last been seen. Tucked under a bridge over a highway, the kind of place you only know about if you know the area well. The rear wheel was damaged in a way consistent with having been struck by a vehicle. It was the first piece of evidence, and it told investigators something crucial. Mickey had not simply disappeared. She had been taken somewhere. The bicycle also gave investigators their next thread. Police went back to the surveillance footage from the night of May 19th and looked harder at the white pickup truck. Frame by frame, they traced the truck's movements, watching it follow Mickey through the streets of Lafayette with a patience that, in the cold light of investigation, was unmistakably purposeful. The truck was a white Chevrolet Silverado. Investigators began reaching out across the region, checking registrations, following leads. The breakthrough arrived from an unlikely direction, a used car dealership. On June 4, 2012, more than 2 weeks after Mickey's disappearance, a dealership employee contacted police with a piece of information. A man named Brandon Scott Laverne had recently come in trying to purchase a white Chevrolet Silverado Z71. He had explained that his own truck had been stolen. The employee remembered him because the circumstances were strange, and because the truck he was seeking to replace was almost identical to the one he claimed had been stolen. Police looked into Laverne's background and found, waiting there in plain sight, a portrait of danger that had already declared itself once before. Brandon Scott Laverne was a registered offender. In 2000, he had pleaded guilty to aggravated battery and been sentenced to 10 years in prison. He had been released in 2008, but the discovery of his history did not end with the sexual assault conviction. Investigators learned that in July 1999, more than a decade before Mickey Shunick climbed onto her bicycle, a woman named Lisa Marie Pate from Youngsville, Louisiana, had been murdered. Her case had gone cold. A grand jury had declined to indict anyone. The case had settled into the long, frustrating silence of an unsolved crime, carried forward year after year by a family that had no answers and a victim who had no justice. When police began looking seriously at Laverne in the context of Mickey's disappearance, the shadow of Lisa Pate fell across the investigation. The connections were troubling. The investigators who had spent years quietly wondering about Pate's murder began to look at Laverne with a new and urgent clarity. Meanwhile, Laverne's original white truck had been found in Texas, burned. On July 5, 2012, 47 days after Mickey Shunick rode her bicycle into the night and never came home, police arrested Brandon Scott Laverne at his home in Church Point, Louisiana, approximately 30 miles from where he had last been seen on surveillance footage following a girl on a bicycle. He was initially picked up on a warrant related to his sex offender status. Investigators believed he had altered his driver's license to remove the mandatory notation identifying him as a registered sex offender. When taken in for questioning about Mickey, he refused to speak. He was charged with first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. Lafayette Police Chief Jim Kraft stood before cameras the following day and delivered words the community had been waiting for with a grief-soaked kind of hope. The hope not that everything would be made right, because nothing could make this right, but that the man responsible would be named and held. The chief explained how the surveillance footage, painstakingly analyzed over weeks, had led investigators step by step to Laverne's door. He noted the damaged bicycle. He noted the white truck. He was careful, measured, precise. He said that based on the evidence, It appeared Laverne had been driving around looking for someone to victimize. The case went to a grand jury on July 18, 2012. The grand jury indicted Laverne on 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for Michaela Mickey Shunick and one for Lisa Marie Pate, the cold case murder from 1999 that had finally been dragged back into the light. Laverne, who had initially pleaded not guilty to all charges and faced the death penalty, reached an agreement with prosecutors. In exchange for sparing his life, he would plead guilty to both murders, would serve 2 consecutive life sentences without any possibility of parole, and, in a condition the Shunick family needed perhaps more than anything else, would lead police to where Mickey's body was buried. On August 17, 2012, Brandon Scott Laverne stood in a Meade County courthouse and entered his guilty pleas. He signed the prosecution's detailed statement of facts, a document that laid out, in precise, unflinching terms, everything that had happened from the moment he first followed Mickey Shunick down St. Landry Street to the moment he buried her body in a sugar cane field 30 to 40 minutes from where he had found her. He was then required to physically recreate his actions from the night of May 19th and to take investigators to Mickey's remains. Mickey's body was found in the sugar cane field in Acadia Parish, exactly as Laverne had described. She had been there for 3 months, through the heat of a Louisiana summer, while her family searched and grieved and refused to stop hoping. She was brought home. The court documents detailing her final minutes were released publicly, and those who read them were struck by the same thing: the extraordinary, almost incomprehensible courage of a 21-year-old girl in an impossible situation. She had not been a passive victim. She had not been taken without protest. Even after being stabbed 4 times, she had gotten up in a dark field in the middle of nowhere and fought back one more time. Her sister Charlie, speaking after the case concluded, described Mickey as a warrior. "My sister Mickey Shunick was a warrior," Charlie said. "If it wasn't for her, our community never would have been able to find her killer." The wounds Mickey inflicted on Laverne, wounds he had to seek hospital treatment for after dumping her bicycle at Whiskey Bay, were precisely what connected him to the crime. The physical evidence of his injuries, the timing of his hospital visit in New Orleans in the days after Mickey's disappearance, became part of the forensic trail that helped confirm what the surveillance footage had suggested. Brandon Scott Laverne was transported to the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, one of the most secure prisons in the country, set in a remote bend of the Mississippi River. He is still there. He has filed appeals in 2015, in 2019, and again more recently, each time attempting to overturn his guilty plea. Each time, the courts have denied him. In October 2023, the Louisiana Supreme Court was the latest to reject his appeal, affirming that he would spend the rest of his life behind those walls. The Shunick family has channeled their grief in the direction Mickey herself would have recognized. In Lafayette, an 8-mile bicycle path now winds through the University of Louisiana campus and through the city Mickey knew and loved. It is called the Mickey Shunick Memorial Loop, and on it cyclists, students, families, strangers ride through the streets of Lafayette in the morning light. It is a small, human, beautiful thing. The transformation of an ending into something that keeps moving forward, the way Mickey always moved forward, pedaling into whatever came next with her whole self committed to the journey. Lisa Marie Pate, whose murder in 1999 had gone without justice for 13 years, was finally given a measure of peace when Laverne pleaded guilty to her killing as well. She was 24 years old when she died. Her family had lived for more than a decade in the particular anguish of an unsolved case, knowing someone had taken their daughter, their sister, and not knowing who or why, or whether justice would ever find its way to her door. In the end, it was a different young woman's fight for survival, a different family's grief, that pried open the case and gave Lisa Pate what she had long deserved. What the case of Mickey Shunick leaves behind is not simply the story of a predator and a victim, though it is, at its most basic, precisely that. It is also the story of what a community does when one of its own disappears. It is the story of a sister who refused to be quiet, who turned her grief into action, and her love into a search campaign that became a model for how families navigate the terrible limbo of not knowing. It is the story of investigators who, frame by frame and lead by lead, built a case from a blurry surveillance image into an irrefutable reckoning. And it is, above all, the story of Mickey herself, a young woman who, in the worst moments a person can face, found reserves of courage that most of us will never be tested to locate. She was 21 years old. She was riding her bicycle home. She was days away from her birthday, and ahead of her stretched the rest of a life she had every right to live. The streets of Lafayette, the warm Louisiana night, the ordinary miracle of a young woman pedaling toward home. All of it was interrupted by a man who chose, deliberately and without justification, to take what was not his. But Mickey Schoenig fought back, and because she fought back, he was found. That is not justice in any complete sense. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is something. It is the proof, written in the record of a court document, that she did not go quietly, that she faced the worst that could be thrown at her with her whole fierce, brave, irreplaceable self, and that in doing so, she gave her family the only gift that was left to give, the name of the man who had taken her, and the certainty that he would never be able to take anyone else. Story 6. The last weekend of October wraps itself in costumes and candlelight and the particular, giddy energy of a holiday that belongs to everyone. Children with plastic pumpkins, neighbors on porches, adults who seize the excuse to be someone else for a single night. In the small town of Dyersburg, Tennessee, in the autumn of 2011, Halloween was no different. The population of roughly 17,000 knew one another the way small-town people do. By their church pews, their children's school hallways, their familiar faces at the local grocery store and the golf club. Dyersburg was the kind of place where a name meant something, where a family's history was part of the shared fabric of the community, where a disappearance could not go unnoticed for long. On the night of October 29, 2011, the eve of Halloween, that fabric tore open. Karen Swift was 44 years old, a mother of 4 children, a woman known in Dyersburg for her blonde hair and her bright presence at community gatherings. Those who had known her for years described the way she had recently seemed to come alive. She had begun spending time at the farm's golf club, a social hub in Dyersburg, with a new circle of friends, laughing more freely, going out in the evenings with an energy that she had perhaps set aside for years while building a family and a marriage. To some who observed this change from the outside, it looked like a woman finding her way back to herself. To others, it looked like upheaval, and at the center of that complicated picture stood her marriage to David Swift, a marriage that was, by October 2011, in the final stages of collapse. 3 weeks before she disappeared, Karen had filed for divorce. It was not the first time. She and David had divorced once before, back in 2000, and had reconciled and remarried that same year. But this time felt different. The filing had a finality to it, the closing of a door rather than the opening of a window. David, by his own account and the account of those who knew him, was hoping to save the marriage. He had asked Karen to have dinner with him on the morning of October 29th, a reaching out, an offer of closeness in the middle of estrangement. Karen said no. That evening, Karen went to a Halloween party. The party was at the home of a friend, a gathering of the social circle she had embraced in those months of transition. She wore a costume. She laughed. She was, by all accounts, present and alive in the way that people are when they are at a party with friends on a holiday, the ordinary pleasures of an ordinary life moving through her. At some point in the early hours of the morning, the precise time debated and never fully resolved, Karen left the party and drove herself home. What happened next would not become known to anyone outside the Swift household, if indeed it became fully known to anyone at all, for weeks to come. On the morning of October 30th, 2011, 2 hunters were moving through the rural roads outside Dyersburg when they came across something that didn't belong. Karen Swift's car, sitting abandoned on the side of a country road near her home. The tire had shredded, not a slow leak, not a gradual flat, but a violent blowout, as though the vehicle had encountered something in the road at speed. The car was empty. Karen was not with it. Later, not far from the abandoned car, two of Karen's cell phones were found near a neighbor's house. Both were shattered, not cracked in the way a phone cracks when dropped, but destroyed in a way that spoke of force and intention. Two phones broken in a field near her home, while Karen herself was nowhere to be found. A missing persons report was filed. The community of Dyersburg, which had woken to a gray autumn Sunday morning following Halloween night, suddenly found itself at the center of a search. Where was Karen Swift? The early days of the investigation carried that particular, suspended quality that missing persons cases have before the worst becomes confirmed. The hours when hope is still possible, when every lead feels like a thread that might unravel into an answer. Volunteers walked fields. Investigators interviewed friends, acquaintances, family members. The question of who had last seen Karen alive became the axis around which everything turned, and the answer that emerged pointed toward her home, and by extension, toward her husband. David Swift told investigators that Karen had come home in the early hours of the morning after the party. He said they had argued. He said she had left. That, he maintained, was the last he saw of her. It was a simple account, and it was all investigators had from the most important witness in the case. Searches were organized. Weeks passed. The community held its breath in that particular way that communities do when one of their own has vanished and no explanation has arrived to fill the silence. Halloween came and went. November settled over western Tennessee with its bare trees and cooling air, and Karen Swift remained missing. Then on December 10th, 2011, 6 weeks after she disappeared, a cemetery caretaker was working near Bledsoe Cemetery in Dyer County, a small, old burial ground set in a rural stretch of countryside, tucked under a tangle of vines and overgrown vegetation, the kind of place that feels forgotten by time. While working, the caretaker noticed something that did not belong among the headstones and the grass. He looked closer, and the missing persons case became a murder case. Karen Swift's body had been hidden beneath dense, tangled vegetation near the cemetery. She was still dressed in her Halloween costume. An autopsy would determine the cause of her death: blunt force trauma to the head. She had been struck with something. Investigators believed it was an object consistent with a heavy, blunt instrument, though the specific weapon was never definitively identified, with enough force to kill her. She had been placed in that overgrown cemetery, hidden beneath vines and brush, left in the cold ground while her children, her friends, and her community searched for her. The grief that descended on Dyersburg in December 2011 had a particular weight to it. The grief of a community that had hoped, day after day for 6 weeks, that Karen might simply be found alive somewhere, lost or hurt but retrievable. That hope, now extinguished, became rage. It became the need for answers. It became the question that would haunt the town for the next decade. Who had done this to Karen Swift? The investigation moved forward, but it moved slowly. The physical evidence was difficult. There was no DNA definitively linking a suspect to the crime. There were no fingerprints recovered from the scene. There were no witnesses who could place a specific person with Karen in the hours between when she left the party and when she arrived home. The investigation, thorough as it tried to be, kept circling back to the same questions without the kind of concrete, incontrovertible proof that prosecutors require to bring charges and win a case at trial. And so the case went cold. This is the cruelest form of unresolved grief. Not the sudden, clean closure of an arrest and a conviction, but the long, hollow silence of a case that sits on a shelf, gathering dust, visited occasionally by investigators who have nothing new to offer. Karen's 4 children grew up in the shadow of that silence. Her friends carried the unanswered question like a weight they could never quite set down. And in Dyersburg, Halloween never felt quite the same. The holiday that had been the backdrop for her last evening alive now arrived each year, trailing its association with the night Karen disappeared. For 11 years, nothing changed. Then, on August 8, 2022, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the Dyer County Sheriff's Department made an announcement that sent a shockwave through the community. David Swift had been arrested. After more than a decade, Karen's husband, the man who had been the last known person to see her alive, the man who had stood at the center of speculation for years, the man who had in the intervening years moved on with a new life, had been charged with the first-degree premeditated murder of his wife. He was indicted by a grand jury and pleaded not guilty. The news reached Karen's daughter Ashley, who was 20 years old at the time of the arrest and had been only 9 when her mother disappeared. Ashley's response captured the full, complicated weight of the moment. The relief of an arrest mixed with the bewilderment of timing. The hope of justice mixed with the pain of having the wound reopened after years of cautiously moving forward. I remember trying to figure out why. Why right now? Why after all these years is this happening? Her question was one the whole community was asking. What had changed? What had investigators found after 11 years of cold silence? The answer came in the form of a trial that began on May 28, 2024, nearly 13 years after Karen's body was found in a cemetery dressed in her Halloween costume. The courtroom in Dyer County became the stage for a case unlike most modern murder trials. From the very first day, the prosecution stood before the jury and was transparent about what they did not have. District Attorney Danny Goodman acknowledged plainly that there would be no DNA evidence, no fingerprint evidence, no ballistic testing. This was not a case built on the kind of forensic certainty that television courtroom dramas have trained audiences to expect. Instead, it was a case built entirely on the architecture of a troubled marriage, on pattern, motive, behavior, and the complex emotional terrain of a man who could not let go. The prosecution's portrait of David Swift was of a man consumed by the prospect of losing his wife permanently. He had, prosecutors argued, monitored Karen's movements throughout the deteriorating period of their marriage, tracking where she went, who she saw, following the geography of her new social life with an attention that went beyond ordinary concern. On the morning of October 29th, just hours before Karen left for the Halloween party, he had made his reconciliatory offer of dinner. She had refused. Assistant District Attorney Tim Box suggested to the jury that this rejection had stayed with David throughout the day, that the understanding that this time Karen was truly leaving had been eating at him from the inside. The prosecution's theory was that when Karen came home from the party in the early hours of October 30th, an argument between the couple had turned lethal, and that David had then moved her body and staged her disappearance to look as though she had driven away and vanished on her own. The shredded tire on Karen's car, the 2 smashed cell phones found in a field. These were, in the prosecution's telling, not the random wreckage of an accident, but evidence of a deliberate attempt to create a narrative of Karen driving away alive, to put distance between David and the moment of her death. The defense, led by attorney Daniel Taylor, worked to dismantle this portrait piece by piece. Taylor argued that David's attempts to reconcile with Karen were evidence not of a dangerous obsession, but of a man still in love with his wife, hoping against hope that their marriage could be saved as it had been saved once before. He challenged the characterization of David's monitoring of Karen's movements, arguing that a man checking on his estranged wife was not the same as a man with violent intent. He pointed out that Karen had full access to their joint bank accounts and came and went as she pleased, that there were no restraining orders, no documented incidents of violence, no history of physical abuse. David Swift himself gave a prison interview in which he spoke with direct, unadorned insistence on his innocence. "I never raised a hand on nobody, now or ever," he said, "and I certainly wouldn't do it to my wife or the mother of my children. It's just not my character." His friends rallied to his defense with similar certainty. "David is too kind a person," said his friend Kim Green. "He would not harm anybody." What emerged at trial was the picture of a marriage in crisis viewed through the lens of 2 different narratives. One that saw a controlling husband driven to murder by rejection, another that saw a flawed marriage in which both people were struggling and neither had crossed into violence. Without forensic evidence to anchor the jury to a concrete moment of crime, they were left to weigh the competing portraits of a man's character against the known facts. That Karen had come home from the party, that David was the last person who acknowledged seeing her, that her car and phones had been found in ways suggesting she had not simply driven away. On June 6, 2024, the jury returned its verdict on the primary charges. David Swift was found not guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. He was found not guilty of second-degree murder. But on the lesser-included charge of voluntary manslaughter, the theory that Karen had been killed not with premeditation, but in the heat of a sudden catastrophic argument, the jury was deadlocked. They could not agree. The judge declared a mistrial on that single count, and David Swift, acquitted of murder but not yet fully free, was held as prosecutors considered their next move. 2 weeks after the mistrial, the Dyer County prosecution made the decision to re-indict David Swift on the voluntary manslaughter charge. A new trial was scheduled for May 7, 2025. But justice, in this case, would not move in a straight line. On a Monday in September 2025, Circuit Judge Mark Hayes ruled that the statute of limitations for voluntary manslaughter had expired, that prosecutors had failed to commence the case within the legally permissible period, and dismissed the charge entirely. David Swift was ordered released from custody, subject to outstanding warrants in other states. Those other warrants related to a case that had unfolded in the years while Karen's murder investigation sat cold. After David relocated to Alabama following Karen's death, he had met a woman named Kelly Essman on the Christian Mingle dating website in 2014. They married in May 2016. The marriage ended in divorce, and what followed, according to Essman and the state of Alabama, was a pattern of stalking behavior that resulted in felony stalking charges filed against David in Jefferson County, Alabama, in July 2023. Essman, speaking publicly for the first time, described the experience of discovering David in her backyard in the middle of the night after they had separated. "I pulled up the feed," she said, her voice carrying the careful steadiness of a woman who has processed something deeply unsettling. "And there he was in my backyard in the middle of the night. He had to drive 40 minutes one way to get to my house." It was a detail that, for those who had followed the Karen Swift case, landed with a particular resonance. The jury in the 2024 trial had been deliberately blocked from hearing about these charges. The law requires that prior crimes be assessed carefully before being introduced, to prevent juries from convicting a person not for what they did but for who they are. But for the community of Dyersburg, for Karen's family and friends, the stalking charges against David in Alabama were not a separate story. They were a continuation of a story that had begun in the difficult, surveilled final months of his marriage to Karen, and they haunted the edges of a case that had never fully resolved. Karen's daughter Ashley, who had spent her entire adult life carrying the weight of her mother's unsolved death, spoke to reporters after the September 2025 dismissal with the kind of quiet, grief-hardened determination that belongs to people who have been left with no good options. "Ultimately, I know my family's truth," she said, "and I know my mom would want me to continue fighting for her. What does it mean to fight for someone who has been gone since Halloween 2011? Found in a cemetery in a costume, buried under vines, killed by blunt force trauma in a way that has never been matched to a specific weapon or a definitively proven hand. Ashley Swift cannot bring her mother back. She cannot undo the years her mother missed, the birthdays and graduations and ordinary Tuesdays that Karen would have filled with the same warm, searching energy she had been rediscovering in the months before her death. What Ashley can do, what she has chosen to do, is refuse to let Karen's story become simply a cold case file on a shelf, a Halloween-adjacent mystery in a small Tennessee town that eventually fades into the background. Karen Swift was 44 years old. She had filed for divorce because she was trying to build a new life, a life that included parties with friends at a golf club, laughter, the particular freedom of a woman beginning to understand what she wanted and moving toward it. She went to a Halloween party in a costume, and she came home to a house where her marriage had collapsed into the rubble of an argument that had no witnesses and left no trace of itself but a woman's body hidden in an overgrown cemetery. The case of Karen Swift is not a case with clean answers. It is not a case that ends with a conviction, a sentence, a a moment of courtroom catharsis in which justice arrives looking the way justice is supposed to look. It is a case in which a woman is dead and the person charged with her death has walked free, not because the jury believed beyond any doubt in his innocence, but because the evidence available, circumstantial and built from the ruins of a marriage, could not carry 12 people unanimously across the threshold of certain guilt. It is a case in which the law's own timelines ultimately became a wall between the charge and the trial. It is, in the end, a case about the space between what a community believes and what a court can prove, a space that Karen's daughter Ashley continues to stand in, refusing to look away, holding her mother's name like a lamp in the dark. The courts have closed their doors, but the question has not closed with them. In Dyersburg, Tennessee, each Halloween brings the season back around to the night a woman in a costume drove home and never came back, and the person responsible for her death has not been held fully to account. The vines at Bledsoe Cemetery have grown back over the years. The headstones stand in their old, quiet rows. But somewhere in the memory of that community, in the grief of 4 children who grew up without their mother, in the stubborn love of a daughter who still speaks her name, Karen Swift is not forgotten, and the search for the full truth of what happened to her has not fully ended. Story 7. The earth at Fisher River Cree Nation keeps its secrets. It holds the memories of seasons, the weight of winter snows, and the fleeting warmth of Manitoba summers. In the spring of 2006, it held a secret far heavier than any stone, a secret wrapped in plastic, buried in a shallow, unmarked grave near the community landfill. It was the secret of a little girl whose life had been a flicker of hope in a world of profound darkness, a girl named Phoenix Victoria Hope Sinclair. Before the shovels came and the news trucks arrived, before her name became a symbol of a system's catastrophic failure, there was only the cold ground, the rustling of dry grass in the wind, and the ghost of a promise that had been violently broken. The story of Phoenix Sinclair does not begin with her birth, but in the echoes of a generation before her. Her mother, Samantha Dawn Kamach, was herself a child of the system, a ghost in the machine long before she created one of her own. Born into a life marred by her own mother's alcoholism, neglect, and abuse, Samantha was adrift from the start. The very safety nets designed to catch children like her became the permanent architecture of her youth. In 1993, she became a permanent ward of Cree Nation Child and Family Services, her childhood defined not by family photos and scraped knees, but by case files and the sterile empathy of social workers. She moved through the world with a detachment born of survival, a coldness that would later be described as a shield against the pain she had endured. The capacity for nurturing, for the fierce, unconditional love of a mother, had been hollowed out of her, replaced by a void of inherited trauma. The cycle was already in motion. At 17, Samantha gave birth to her first child, a baby boy. The pregnancy was a secret, a hidden fact until the moment of birth, and she had received no prenatal care. The authorities, seeing the same patterns of instability that had defined Samantha's own life, intervened immediately. Winnipeg Child and Family Services, WCFS, apprehended the baby at birth. An opportunity was given, a placement in a supported living home for young mothers, a chance to prove she could break the cycle. But the damage was too deep. After a few months, it was clear she could not meet her son's most basic needs, and he was made a permanent ward of the state, just as she had been. The first echo had sounded, a quiet warning of the tragedy to come. 2 years later, on April 23, 2000, Samantha gave birth again, this time to a girl. She named her Phoenix. The name itself, a symbol of rebirth from ashes, carried a weight of hope that the circumstances of her birth could not support. Once again, there had been no prenatal care. Once again, the hospital alerted WCFS, concerned about Samantha's emotional maturity and her ability to care for this new, fragile life. Samantha and the baby's father, Stephen Sinclair, admitted they were not in a position to be parents. On April 24th, just 1 day old, Phoenix Sinclair was placed under apprehension, her life immediately rerouted into the labyrinthine child welfare system that had failed her mother so profoundly. But for a time, it seemed Phoenix might escape the ashes of her family's past. She was placed in the care of Kim Edwards and her husband Rohan, family friends who became her godparents. In their home, Phoenix was not a case file, she was a beloved child. She was surrounded by stability and affection, a world away from the chaos of her origins. She blossomed, a happy and vibrant little girl whose laughter filled the house. For Kim Edwards, this was more than foster care. It was a promise. A promise to this child that she would be safe, that she would be loved, that the darkness that had consumed her mother would not touch her. The system, however, is a clumsy and bureaucratic beast, its gears often grinding with a logic that defies human emotion. Phoenix's life became a painful ping-pong match between the safety of the Edwards home and the cold mechanics of the child welfare system. She was bounced between foster placements and short-lived, failed attempts at reunification with her biological father. Despite the instability, her anchor remained the loving home of Kim Edwards, the one place she was consistently cherished. In 2003, a crucial decision was made. WCFS closed Phoenix's file, believing she was safe in the care of her father, Stephen Sinclair. They were wrong. For months, Phoenix was lost to the system, living in deplorable conditions. But the love Kim Edwards had for the child was a force the system had not accounted for. Edwards tracked Phoenix down and, horrified by what she found, fought to have the child returned to her care. She succeeded. For a brief, hopeful period, Phoenix was safe again. Then, in June 2004, the cycle turned once more, this time with fatal consequences. Samantha Kamach, a woman who had shown no stable ability to parent, who had already lost one child to the system, was granted unsupervised custody of her daughter. To Kim Edwards and others who knew Samantha's history, the decision was inexplicable, a terrifying miscalculation. Without explanation, the system that had sheltered Phoenix for most of her life delivered her back into the hands of the woman from whom it had once sought to protect her. Phoenix, then 4 years old, was taken from the only stable home she had ever known. The promise Kim Edwards had made to her was broken by a bureaucratic signature. Samantha had a new partner, a man named Carl Wes McKay. He was a man with his own dark history, a history that included warnings sent to WCFS years earlier about his violent tendencies, warnings that had been filed away and forgotten. Together, they moved with Phoenix and McKay's own children into a house on the Fisher River Cree Nation, a remote community about 200 kilometers north of Winnipeg. It was in this house, over the next year, that the hope embodied in Phoenix's name was systematically and sadistically extinguished. The home on Fisher River was not a place of safety and warmth. It became a private, isolated chamber of horrors, and Phoenix was its designated victim. The abuse was not a secret, explosive loss of temper. It was methodical, continuous, and cruelly imaginative. While the other children in the home were largely spared, Phoenix was singled out for a campaign of torture that is difficult to comprehend. Samantha Kamach and Carl McKay, the two people who were supposed to be her protectors, became her tormentors. They beat her with their fists and their feet. They used metal bars. They choked her until she lost consciousness, a terrifying game of power played on a 5-year-old's fragile body. They shot her with a BB gun, the small pellets embedding themselves in her skin as she writhed in pain. In an act of ultimate degradation, they forced her to eat her own vomit. Her world shrank to the confines of an unfinished, unheated concrete basement, a cold, dark space where she was often confined, isolated from any small comfort or human kindness. In March 2005, 3 months before Phoenix's death, the system had one last chance to save her. A child welfare worker, following up on a concern, visited the family home. The worker spoke to Kamach and McKay, but never asked to see Phoenix. Satisfied with their excuses, that the child was sleeping or with a relative, the worker left. No one ever followed up. The final safety net had torn, and Phoenix was left in a free fall toward her death. In the final weeks of her life, Phoenix's small body was a roadmap of their cruelty. Her bones were broken and left to heal on their own. She was emaciated, starved of both food and affection. The final assault came on June 11, 2005. After a prolonged and brutal beating, Phoenix's body finally gave out. The specific blow that ended her life was never determined, but it did not matter. Her death was not the result of a single act, but the culmination of a year of relentless torture, a death by 1,000 cuts, blows, and heartbreaks. The jury at their trial would later understand this, concluding that both Camacho and McKay were equally responsible, their combined actions and inactions constituting a clear, murderous intent. With Phoenix's lifeless body in their home, Camacho and McKay's cruelty entered a new, colder phase, the cover-up. There was no panic, no remorseful call to the police. There was only the calculated act of self-preservation. They wrapped the little girl's body in a plastic garbage bag, drove to a wooded area near the community landfill, and buried her in a shallow, hastily dug grave. They erased her from the world as if she had never existed. But they did not erase her from the government's books. For the next 9 months, Samantha Camacho and Carl McKay continued to collect welfare and child tax benefits in Phoenix Sinclair's name, pocketing the money that was meant to provide for the child they had just murdered and buried. They moved back to Winnipeg and had another child together in December 2005. When friends or acquaintances asked where Phoenix was, the lies came easily. She was living with her father, they said, or staying with another relative. The secret remained safe, buried under a thin layer of Manitoba soil. The truth, when it finally emerged, did not come from the diligent work of Child Protective Services. It came from the conscience of a child. In March 2006, one of Carl McKay's sons, who had witnessed the horrific abuse, could no longer carry the secret. He and his mother went to the Winnipeg police and told them everything. They told them Phoenix was dead. The investigation began immediately. When authorities confronted Camacho and McKay, the couple made one last, desperate attempt to maintain their lie. They tried to pass off another young girl as Phoenix, hoping to fool the investigators. The ruse failed instantly. The house of cards they had built on a foundation of cruelty and deceit came crashing down. They were arrested. On March 18, 2006, guided by information from the investigation, RCMP officers began to dig at the Fisher River landfill. It didn't take long to find the plastic bag. Inside were the skeletal remains of a small child. The ghost of Phoenix Sinclair had been found. The trial of Samantha Camacho and Carl McKay began in 2008. The details that emerged in the courtroom horrified the nation. The defense lawyers did not deny the abuse, but argued that the Crown could not prove who struck the final, fatal blow, and that a conviction for manslaughter was more appropriate. The jury saw through the legal maneuvering. On December 12, 2008, they found both Camacho and McKay guilty of first-degree murder. They were sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. In April 2009, nearly 4 years after she was killed, Phoenix Victoria Hope Sinclair was finally given a proper burial in Brookside Cemetery in Winnipeg. Her death, however, left an indelible scar on the province. How could a child, known to the child welfare system from the day she was born, disappear and be tortured to death without anyone noticing? The public outcry led to one of the largest and most expensive public inquiries in Manitoba's history, costing over $10 million. The Phoenix Sinclair inquiry, though delayed for years by legal challenges from the Social Workers Union, laid bare the systemic rot within the child welfare system. It was a story of crushing caseloads, poor communication, ignored warnings, and a tragic failure of accountability at every level. The echoes of Phoenix's life and death continue to reverberate. In July 2022, the Parole Board of Canada made a decision that sent a shockwave of fresh pain through those who had loved her. Samantha Camacho, then 40 years old, was granted a series of escorted temporary absences from prison. The board's report noted that she had made significant progress. She had married another female inmate, participated in counseling and sweat lodge ceremonies, and finally accepted responsibility for her role in her daughter's death. She told the board she grew up with no values, suffering abuse that left her selfish and cold, and that she was grieving the loss of her indigenous culture. A psychological assessment deemed her a low risk to reoffend. The absences were approved for visits with her new wife's family and for spiritual development with an indigenous elder. For Kim Edwards, the news was a profound betrayal, a re-traumatization that reopened every wound. She had become a registered victim with the Correctional Service of Canada, and she had submitted a powerful statement opposing any form of release. "I could write 1,000 pages as to why this woman should not be allowed this privilege," she wrote to the board. She spoke of the promise she had made to keep Phoenix safe, a promise the system had forced her to break. "It keeps me awake at night," she said, her voice thick with tears and rage. "I can't deal with the fact that I made a promise and I can't keep it." To her, these temporary leaves were not a sign of rehabilitation. They were a reward for a child murderer, an undermining of the justice that had been so painfully won. The story of Samantha Camach and Phoenix Sinclair is a chilling Mobius strip of generational trauma, a cycle of abuse that flowed from mother to daughter until it culminated in an act of unimaginable violence. It is the story of a system that, despite its best intentions, became a bystander to a slow-motion murder. And at its heart, it is the story of a little girl named Phoenix, a child of hope who was born into ashes, and whose tragic death forced a painful, necessary reckoning, leaving behind not a story of rebirth, but the haunting ghost of a life that never had a chance to burn bright.